next guest is author Robert Mazur. He's an author we had on the program, I'm going to guess about 8 years ago, with his book at the time called The Infiltrator, later made into a movie starring Bryan Cranston, and now has another book out called The Betrayal. Bob, good morning. You're on Eastern Panhandle Talk with Rob and Mike and Anish. Great to have you with us again.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me back.
Well, I have to tell you, the first time we had you on regarding the Infiltrator, I was listening to your story, and you went undercover, money laundering schemes, the mob, the whole thing. It sounded like a great movie, and it turned out to be a pretty darn good movie, too. And now this next book, The Betrayal, deals with more issues involving the Cali Cartel as well. Can you tell us a little bit about this book and your experience?
Sure. After the events of the undercover operation that are laid out in The Infiltrator, I spent about 2 years traveling around the world testifying in those trials, and when that was over, I was recruited by the Drug Enforcement Administration to move over to that agency with a hope that I would lead a long-term undercover operation infiltrating the Cali Cartel, totally new identity, totally new front companies, and in fact, I got that opportunity. And the twist in The Betrayal is that, unfortunately, I suffered at the hands of corruption within my own agency, in that one of the people who was working with me was on the take, working with the Cali Cartel, and almost got me killed. But the Betrayal title really doesn't just go to that officer's conduct. It really goes to, I think, a betrayal within the system that comes from law enforcement, from regulators, from the private sector, from governments, who are involved in well-intended, but, the old saying, I think credited to Albert Einstein, is insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. But we only need look at the conditions that exist today with respect to illicit drugs and the fortunes, the unbelievable fortunes that have been accumulated by the huge number of criminal organizations, not just Mexican cartels and Colombian cartels, which now are working with Hezbollah, spreading drugs all over the world, but also the Chinese triads. In West Virginia, you certainly see a tremendous amount of fentanyl. That fentanyl is coming from among other places, from China, from unregulated pharmaceutical companies controlled by the triads that work closely with other criminal organizations. And frankly, things aren't getting better. And why is it that we are so reluctant to look in the mirror and just say, okay, we're doing some things good, but we're not getting where we want to go? And what do we need to do to recalibrate the war on drugs? And I think there's some very critical things that we need to do. So that's part of the betrayal. And the other betrayal I faced, I didn't really even understand some of the things that motivated me during the Infiltrator case, and now during this the Betrayal story, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself, about my motivations, and no matter how much you feel as though you may have done some things that are good, when you finish that journey, which I have, I feel a deep-seated betrayal to my own family, because there are people who are extraordinarily important in my life, who I unfortunately, in order to stay alive, couldn't really be there for them as much as I should have been. And now I'm doing everything I possibly can to try to make up for that.
Is it common for an agent to do two separate major undercover operations?
No, probably not. And one of my teachers, one of my mentors, who was involved in training me as an outstanding undercover agent by the name of Joe Pistone, who the book and the movie Donnie Brasco is based upon. And Joe did 5 years undercover within Italian-American mafia. I did 2 operations that were a little bit over 2 years each. So he endured the same amount of time, but it is pretty unusual for 2 long-term operations for someone to get the opportunity to do 2 long-term ones. When I was in the first one, it was clear to me. I was on the money side. I was dealing with bankers, dirty bankers, and major international businessmen. They were tripping over each other in an effort to try to get a piece of the money laundering pie. And I tried in that case to open the eyes of the world to the fact that there is this active involvement by the corrupt factions of the banking business and financial service provider industry. And I didn't quite get there. So I was driven to try to get back into that underworld and to rip another mask off. And in the Betrayal story, you'll see when you read it that, there were a dozen bankers and a dozen banks that were actively involved in laundering funds. And one of the things that is a betrayal to the good people of the world is that the way governments go after this is they fine institutions. They do not prosecute individuals. They rarely prosecute individuals. And what happens when you put like an HSBC paid a $1.9 billion fine when they were caught moving money for the Mexican and Colombian cartels and doing many other things? That's paid by the shareholders. That's not paid by the people who did the dirty work. We need to be putting individuals behind bars for long periods of time who intentionally get involved in this conduct. The United Nations on Drugs and Crime did a study, getting information from the country members, identifying that there's roughly about $2 trillion a year looking to be laundered every year from different types of illicit activity. That goes from the range of tax evasion to drug trafficking to illegal arms dealing to trying to deal with countries that are sanctioned like Iran. $2 trillion. Of that, $400 billion roughly is said to come from the sale of illegal drugs every single year. The U.S. at best seizes about $1 billion in drug proceeds, and that's 1/4 of 1%. So the coffers of these criminal organizations exponentially grow year after year after year, and the corruption that you see now is amazing. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, all of these countries and many more have unbelievably poor records when it comes to the issue of corruption. You can look at, last year we put away the brother of the president of Honduras for life for his involvement in drug trafficking, operating cocaine labs. He himself was formerly an elected official, involved with senators in that country, as well as many other people, including bankers who were there. And the evidence in that case, and the evidence in other cases, alleged that there were millions and millions of dollars that were going into the hands of the president's brother, Juan Orlando Hernandez. He's still the president. We arrested, in the case of Mexico, we arrested a guy who was known within the cartels and a big asset of one of the Mexican cartels. His nickname was El Pedrino, the Godfather. It turns out he was the defense secretary, General Salvador Cienfuegos of Mexico, the active defense secretary. We arrested him, put him behind bars, tried to get him to trial. Pressure from Mexico caused us to release him because they were going to prosecute him under their own laws, and we were infringing on the sovereignty of Mexico by holding him in the United States. Once he got back there, within 30 days, they decided that there was no proof of his crimes, and he's free. This stuff goes on, unfortunately, every day. So we really do need to take a long and hard look at what we can do better.
Anish.
And one of the... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Robert, thanks for joining us. I had a question about that. So, I mean, you've covered so much here, and obviously we're failing on what it is that we're trying to do, which is stem the flow of illegal drugs into the United States. What are your thoughts? I mean, clearly this corruption goes to all levels of government or industry that you want to talk about. And I saw a comment on our Facebook page that, it's great that you highlighted that it's usually the little guys, the users and people on the other end of things that get penalized. But do you feel like decriminalization or what's going on with marijuana across some of the states here in the United States, that's going to be a way to kind of eat into the pie? Because it sounds like these people just speak money, and when you kind of take their money source away from them, we know that we're going to have people using certain drugs, and that's not to say that we shouldn't combat that. But do you agree with that sentiment, or do you feel like that's missing the mark as well?
Well, I guess we can debate the marijuana issue, but if we want to go on to fentanyl, we want to go on to methamphetamine, I'm not so sure that I want to be a part of a society that makes that readily available to anybody who wants to grab it. I really think that the problem is on the demand side. I have two cousins who died from heroin overdoses, and one who I spent months and months trying to get a bed where he could be treated. The amount of resources that we apply toward drug education and drug treatment is anemic. But most importantly, and I think if there's anything that's going to be a silver bullet that could turn the tide, is to provide underprivileged and underserved communities with access to equal education and economic opportunity. I think we should have free education for 14 years, and for those who excel at it, should get 2 more. There are underserved and underprivileged communities that generation after generation after generation have very little opportunity. Now, you're going to say, how can you pay for that? In 2020, we put 1.8 million people behind bars. It cost at the least $25,000, and in some states as high as in the $60,000s per year to maintain those people. Don't you think we ought to try to figure out how it is that we can get that number way down from 1.8 million? That is a serious, serious problem that I think we need to address. As far as these criminal organizations, they're not even just involved in drugs. They'll still steal natural resources. They'll do anything. These are organized criminal organizations. And when it comes to marijuana, some of the areas where there are limited, but there are legal permits to sell marijuana, the cost of the marijuana in the official route is considerably higher than the black market. There are certainly still organizations, and you read about it all the time, that unfortunately it's become so popular that people are going on to federally controlled lands and using all types of chemicals to cultivate and harvest their marijuana, getting people sicker than ever could possibly be imagined from it. So, there's going to be people, the money is so big. When I was in the working with the Medellin Cartel, it cost $500 to make a kilo of cocaine. And on average, about $2,500 per kilo cost for transportation. They were moving, people I dealt with were moving tons at a time. So $3,000 investment. In the wholesale markets at that time, $14,000 to $15,000 is what you'd get per kilo. So they're making $12,000, $11,000 per kilo on 2,000, 4,000 kilos at a time. That's huge, huge money. It's not going to stop on the supply side. But I have to say, as gloomy as I guess I sometimes probably sound to some people, 99.99% of the law enforcement officers in this country are tremendously dedicated, honest public servants. I dedicated my book to the more than 22,000 law enforcement officers who made the supreme sacrifice and whose names are on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Wall. We have a real desire to attack on the supply side, but we also need to improve on the supply side because we are under-resourced. We, in fact, the system is set up in a way not to support doing the types of cases I had the privilege to do. You mentioned before, why is it that so many people on the low end of the totem pole in the drug world wind up getting prosecuted and imprisoned? There's an institutional reason for that. And that is that I can tell you when I was in DEA, about every September, my boss would come in the room where everybody was at and say, I don't care what you're working on right now. Stop working on it. get over to the locals, adopt as many of the local cases as you possibly can. We need to get the numbers up between now and the end of October, the end of the fiscal year. Why? Because after that, you're going to have the leaders of the agency go before Congress. And Congress is, I guess the best they can do is count numbers of arrests and numbers of seizures. So if we have the numbers are up, we're going to be able to maintain our budget or increase our budget. The other problem you have is that people who go into management basically wind up going from supervisor to assistant special agent in charge to the next one about every 18 months to 2 years. They get graded on how well they did by the number of arrests and seizures. Well, which of them is going to have the courage to say, okay, let's start this 4-year undercover operation. We have no idea if we're going to succeed. It's going to take high resources, and it just doesn't happen. The training is not there for doing that type of work, and the understanding of the systemic methods by which money is laundered is not there. We need to improve our game.
Where can we find your book, sir?
Well, you can go on Amazon.com. It's going to be officially released on April 1st, but you can pre-purchase it now. It's going to be in hard copy, also an audio book. I just finished reading that in the studio, as well as Kindle and paperback.
Very good. Thank you, sir. And that, again, is Robert Mazur, M-A-Z-U-R, and The Betrayal, and appreciate his sneak preview of the book ahead of its release here.